where we're going from here, what you're doing most immediately. And to do that, I need to give you a little bit of understanding and some background to the English language, because it plays a big role in Caedmon, his poetry that you just memorized, and Canterbury Tales that you're reading next. English language is of foremost importance to these two authors. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to the English language and kind of the beginnings of English. So let me create a little timeline for you. I would encourage you to write this in your notes. We are concerned with two time periods for right now. 449 to 1066 and 1066 to 1485. Those are the dates we're most concerned with for now. 449 to 1066 is what we call the Anglo-Saxon era. And 1066 to 1485 is the Middle Ages. Prior to 449, there were some inhabitants on this island called Britain. Now we call it Britain or Great Britain. The earliest inhabitants were called Iberians, I-B-E-R-I-A-N-S, exactly how it sounds, Iberians. Those Iberians, recent studies think, were Spanish fishermen. Iberians were probably Spanish fishermen, and they were kind of the original inhabitants of England. They're who found the island first. In addition to the Celts. You've heard of the Celts, C-E-L-T-S. So those Iberians and Celts bring the Celtic language and the Spanish language onto this island. So because they called the island Britain, then they, as people, are called Britons. They are the originals. If you were to DNA test the people living in England currently, there's a tiny, minuscule part of the populace that still has evidence of ancestry from these Iberians and Celts. So they are the ones who can say they've sort of always been there. Now, around 55 BC, the Romans invaded the island. 55 BC, the Romans invaded the island. And this is under the reign of Julius Caesar, when there's the idea that the Roman Empire was just going to eventually take over the world, and they're spreading and they're growing and they're establishing their reign all over the place. So when the Romans come into England, they primarily leave behind them their language and roadways and walls. Roads and walls. The Romans leave behind them, because eventually they leave. We'll get to that in a second. The Romans leave behind them their language, roadways, and walls. The reason that's important is when we're traveling through England, you will inevitably hear our tour guides talking about, this is Roman wall. These are Roman ruins. These are Roman baths. In fact, we're going to Bath, England, which they pronounce Bath. We will be going to Bath, England, and we will see, we kind of go down inside where these Roman pools used to take place, and they would bathe in the hot mineral waters, and it was like resort living. They also believed that you could have healing there. So we're going to go there. So you're going to see the influence of the Romans dating back to 55 to 409, so way before this. Okay. In 409, the Romans kind of lose their hold on England. Any guesses why they would withdraw from England? Yes.
Is it because the Roman Empire split?
Yes, the central hub of the Roman Empire is kind of in threat. They are being attacked. So I like to dumb down history to help it make sense to me. So the way I understand it, essentially it would be like, they didn't have text messages. If they did, they would get a text that looked something like, "You can't defend that little island anymore. We need you at home because we're under attack here. Like, troops rally this way." Okay? So they withdraw from England. Maybe they left some guys along the walls to defend the land, but they were too weak. Now here's what happens. People from tribes from other nearby countries recognize they just left. This is kind of a vulnerable position for this island. Here's our chance. So you have 4 main people groups attacking England during this time. Write down these 4 people groups. The Angles, Angles. The Saxons, the Jutes, Jutes, and the Danes. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Danes. The Angles and the Saxons were Germanic tribes. So maybe where you wrote Angles and Saxons, you kind of put in parentheses Germanic, Germans. And then the Jutes and the Danes are Scandinavian Vikings. Scandinavia, Sweden, Finland, Norway, that area. They're Vikings from there. So you have all 4 of these people groups, and these are warriors. They're no longer like the Spanish fishermen that were there first, or the Celtic shepherds. Like, they are a warring tribe. And they just start bombarding the island. So from the years I told you, the Romans withdrew in 409. From 409 to 449, how many years is that? 40. For those 40 years, everybody's trying to gain England or Britain for themselves. Okay, they want it to be their land. Ultimately, the Angles and the Saxons begin to intermarry. So you can see how kind of combining their efforts makes them the stronger unit. Okay? So then they take over. When the Romans came in, they kind of pushed the Celts and Iberians to the north and to the west. So that's Scotland and Wales. That's why Wales has a very strong Celtic influence. In fact, when we go there, we're going to go to an abbey in Wales, so you actually get in 2 countries while you're there. So in Wales, you'll hear the Celtic influence in their language. You'll see it in the signs, because they were pushed to the west, and to the north in Scotland. So the Romans withdraw, the Anglo-Saxons kind of take rule, and the Anglo-Saxons were the rulers of this land called Britain from 449 to 1066. Consider then what's happening to the language. You had the Spanish fishermen, you had the Celtics, you had the Germanic tribes, you have the Roman influence, you have the Scandinavian Vikings. All of these are merging into one new language, and this is the birth of the English language. The reason we call it English and the reason we call it England is because of this group right here, the Angles. They didn't want to call this Britain because they weren't the original inhabitants. They wanted to call it Anglaland. Anglaland, after the Angles. And then by the Middle Ages, this time, it kind of morphed a little bit to England. And then in modern English, it moved to England. So there's a word that perfectly illustrates the transition of 3 main eras of the English language. You need to know the 3 main eras of the English language are the Old English, which happens in this time of the Anglo-Saxons, the Middle English, which happens in the Middle Ages, and modern English, which happens after the Middle Ages. Do you know what this means? It means that everything after about 1485 is considered modern English. Really? That's kind of cool. So I've had students say to me before, I can't read Shakespeare. That Old English is so confusing. Old English? Are you kidding me? Like, this is Old English, 449 to 1066. Shakespeare is actually modern English. So I want you to look at the board for a minute up here, and I'm going to show you and let you hear the differences in these three eras of the English language. First, can you see this right up here? It looks kind of like, if you had to guess at it, it sort of looks like Opep Hippon Pade or something. Does that look like the English language?
Yeah, extremely.
To me, it looks a little like hieroglyphics. And some of the letters are not quite like our letters, but the pronunciation even is very different. Caedmon, that you memorized his poem, Caedmon wrote in the Old English. So what you memorized was a modern translation of Old English. Would you like to hear, if Caedmon were standing in front of you today and he lived in the 600s, this is how it would sound if he were standing before you reciting the poem that you just recited. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Nu skall herjan heaven reaches wide, Methodus machte, and his modjethunk, work would father, Zwei wundriga wes, aged richten, or on stalde. He eres chop ilda barnum, heaven till rova, halli shitten. Than middenjard mankinis ward, aged richten after teode, Irum foldan frea allmächtig. Nu skall herjan.
Is that so strange to hear? So let me tell you a little about that. The reason we're studying this it's twofold. One is I want you to see the transformation of the English language over time. That you just heard was the birth of the English language that we now all speak. The birth of it. That's how they talked. The reason it sounded melodic and that they have music set to it is because they didn't have the capabilities of writing then. The only people that were writing were the people who lived in monasteries, because it was the center of cultural learning. I mean, if you were going into the clergy, you had to be the ones to read scripture in the Old Greek and Hebrew. You had to be the ones to read it in Latin to your audiences. It was your responsibility to gain learning that way. If you weren't in clergy, you were probably a warrior or a warrior's wife. And then I just pictured these women as like really tough, because they're having to build a civilization essentially. So if you were sitting around a campfire with other Vikings telling stories, you might have someone set it to music so that it's really memorable. You might really focus on the sound qualities of the words that you're using so that they could learn it and pass it on. The Anglo-Saxon poets were called Scopes, S-C-O-P-S. Looks like scops, pronounced Scopes. Those Anglo-Saxon Scopes are the poets. They are responsible for what we know about the Anglo-Saxons because they created story that then was passed down through the oral tradition years after years after years before finally someone has the capability to write it down. Now, Caedmon, who lived in the 600s, was a poet, a religious poet, and was in fact the first religious poet whose works and name are known. So he's hugely important. But only one of his poems survived, and it's the one that you memorized. So you memorized the first poem ever written in the English language. Kind of cool. Now, what's even cooler than that, and this is the new part of the trip for me, I've never been here before. When we are in the York region, we're gonna have a little day trip to the coast. And on none of my tours have we ever gone to the coast of England. So we are going to the coast to a little seaside village called Whitby. And on the side of a cliff overlooking the sea are the ruins of this abbey. And that is where Caedmon lived and worked as a herdsman and wrote his religious poetry. It also is the same abbey that inspired Dracula. So it's gonna be really cool when we go there. I mean, now it's interesting to say, oh, cool, I just memorized the first poem written in the English language. Imagine how you're gonna feel that day sitting by the sea in the ruins of Whitby Abbey, knowing this is where Caedmon lived and wrote, and this inspired Dracula. Isn't that exciting? And I've never been, so I'm gonna be like giddy that day to see this new part. We're gonna have lunch that day by the sea. We're gonna explore the little village, probably a theater performance that night. It'll be cool. Now, I'm gonna tell you much more about the life of Caedmon when we're there, because I think that would be a kind of cool atmosphere to tell you more about him. But I wanted you to understand a little bit about the beginnings of our language. This does not look like English. It certainly doesn't sound like English. Aren't you glad I didn't make you memorize it in the Old English? I thought about it for about 10 minutes. Now, oh, you'd like to? You can. How about you can do that for extra credit? Okay. Moving on. Your next project is going to be reading select stories from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Geoffrey Chaucer is really called the father of the English language. Write that down. Geoffrey Chaucer is the father of the English language. His name is on the board so you can see it. And the reason is because he was the first dude ever to write a considerable body of work in the English language. Now, he lived in the 1300s, so I'm not suggesting that he was the first ever to think up a story in England, that nothing happened prior to that. But before that, it was all oral tradition. It was passed down orally, and then finally maybe recorded by a monk. But Geoffrey Chaucer is the first to write a significant body of work in the English language. But by this time, the language was changing. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote in the language of the common people. So he wrote for everybody. Anybody living during his time would have been able to understand the way he wrote. He wrote for all people. And I'm going to tell you what his stories are about in a minute. But as we're still focused on language, he wrote in the Middle English, which is really the first written language, written era of the English language. Look in the box right up here. Can you see those letters and words? Whan, W-H-A-N. That. April, A-P-R-I-L-L. With his shores. Suta. Do you see this word D-R-O-G-H-T-E? It looks like drulta. It's drought. Of March, hath, hair said, pierced, to the rota, root. It's starting to look more like our language. The letters are starting to look more familiar. If you see it written out, there are some funky looking F's and things like that, but it is definitely a lot more comprehensible to us. You could read it. You could pick out probably a few words out of every line. Your pronunciation would be horrible, But compared to the Old English, it's a significant improvement in terms of getting closer to the language that we speak now. Would you like to hear what Middle English sounds like?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
If you have your Geoffrey Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, and the Joseph Placer, I think this is page 11. You can check me because you recited this morning. I'm now going to recite to you the first 18 lines of this work in the Middle English. See, check me on that, page 11. See if you see some Old English,
Yes,
Middle
yes.
English. Okay. Don't be alarmed because you're not reading this work in the Middle English. That's why I told everybody to get the Joseph Placer version, because you are reading a modern translation of this work. But this is how Chaucer wrote it. And to start off Canterbury Tales, if I were reading it to you in the Middle English, here's what it sounds like. Juan Tarapro with his shora sota, the druta marcha parsa de rota, and bothered every vine in sweet liquor, of which thereto engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus, is that the next?
Yeah.
When Zephyrus eke with his sweet to breathe, in spirit hath in every holten heath, the tondre crapes and the youngest son, hath in the rames have corsiron, and smalle fallis maken melodie, that sleepen not in yet with open ear. So pricket them not on here garages, then a long involved to go in on pilgrimages. And palmares for to seek in strondes, to verne always good and sundry landes. And especially from every citizenda of England to Canterbury they winde, the holy blissful martyr for to seek that him hath opened one that they were seeking. That is Middle English. That's how Chaucer wrote.
Middle English. That sounds like
And if you were living during that time, that would have made perfect sense to you. Essentially, listen up. Essentially, Geoffrey Chaucer starts the story with when April's fruitful rains descend, when springtime comes. It's a great time of year for pilgrims to go on pilgrimages. So people from all over England, they pilgrimage from England, or from parts of England to Canterbury. And they go there to see this shrine of St. Thomas of Becket. So that's kind of the gist of the first 18 lines. Now what you're going to be reading, what you'll find out in the general prologue, is the whole kind of background story, and it will make sense to you because it's in modern English. If you look at the actual text of Joseph Placer's version, you're going to totally get it. It is poetry, but you don't have to stop reading at the end of every line. Just read for the punctuation, and it'll sound like just normal prose. Okay? You're going to be reading the general prologue where you get the background information and you get all of the characterization of the pilgrims on this journey. And then you're going to read 7 or 8 of the pilgrims' stories. Now, I would like to explain to you the framework of Geoffrey Chaucer's story to help you feel ready for the first activities that you're going to do for our next class. But just before that, in conclusion of our English language studies, I want to show you modern English. I've shown you old and middle, now modern. To mourn a mischief that is past and gone is the next way to draw new mischief on. Did you understand what I just said? Does it look like words that you can read?
Yeah.
Isolated, do you understand the meaning of every word on the board?
Yeah.
Do you know who wrote this?
No, Geoffrey Chaucer.
This was in Othello by William Shakespeare.
Obviously.
So, that means you can never say to me that Shakespeare is Old English because he's modern English. He wrote in the late 1500s, early 1600s, but it's our language. You know what's hard about Shakespeare? It's only the syntax. He puts things in a weird word order, so we might have to look for a second to find the subject. A few archaic words, but Shakespeare makes up a ton of our language. one day I'll show you like all the words Shakespeare's responsible for that we use now. It's unbelievable. Or maybe you've done that, like with Miss Nicholas, she loves that idea too. So that's the transitions of old, middle, and modern English. Now, put your attention here because this is where our studies begin for our October the 31st deadlines. You are going to be reading the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. And as I told you, he wrote in Middle English, but that was the common language of the people. Geoffrey Chaucer understood a lot about society because he had so many different jobs. You might jot down some of the jobs that he had. He worked actually in the political arena, which means he's hanging out with royalty.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat?
He worked in the political arena, so he's hanging out with royalty. He also was a sort of merchant. He was in charge of the duties or taxes on imports and exports, specifically wine, coming in or out of England. He controlled the taxes on that. So he had a lot of people working for him. He was also in training to be a knight. He was in training to be a knight. He was also a Christian, a member of the church, and his daughter was a nun. He was a Christian, a member of the church, and his daughter was a nun. There's actually much more than that, but do you get kind of the well-roundedness of him so far? He's rubbing shoulders with royalty. He's working right in amongst the middle class, if you will, workers. But he's also seeing the church and corruption of the middle church firsthand. And he knows a lot about the nunnery and that whole thing because of his daughter. So with all of, and working his way up to knighthood. So with all of these experience, he can speak knowledgeably about a whole lot of different levels of society. Here's why this is important. You know what, I would so much rather you just listen now, and then if you need to review with the video later, you can, because it's a little bit much to try to write all this down, but I want you to get the sense of it. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote 24 fragmented tales from all different characters' perspectives. Out of those 24, only 16 are complete. And out of those 16, you're only going to read 8. Now, the reason this is important is because in the general prologue of Canterbury Tales, you find out that there were 29 pilgrims. And I'm going to talk about who they were and where they're going in a minute. But there were 29 pilgrims on a pilgrimage. That means on a quest or on a journey, right? Now, among those 29, Geoffrey Chaucer originally had the idea and presents the idea in the general prologue that while they're traveling, while they're on their pilgrimage, they needed some entertainment. See, they can't put in DVD players in the car. They can't just put on their headphones and listen to some music. They have no real form of entertainment, but they're on a long journey. So Geoffrey Chaucer proposes, hey guys, I know what we can do. We can tell stories. 2 stories from each pilgrim on the way there, 2 stories on the way back. Now, I need somebody to do the quick math of this. If there were 29 pilgrims, and they're each planning to tell 2 stories on the journey, and 2 stories on the way back, that's 4 stories per pilgrim. How many stories would that have been?
116.
116. Which means if Geoffrey Chaucer truly intended to write that many stories, he fell way short of that. Because that would have been 116 stories. I don't know if he ever really intended to make it that far, or if he got bored and gave up, or if he ran out of new material. A lot of his stories have basis in older stories, Latin stories and mythology and things like that. But he just used those as a kind of inspiration piece, and then he creates 24 stories. Instead of 116, he creates 24. Out of those 24, some of them are incomplete, like he died before they were done. So we have 16 total stories, but some of them are crude and inappropriate. And so I've narrowed it down to 8. But here's the 8 that I'm giving you. I'm giving you ones that are godly and moral, and they're told by nuns, and they're about Christian martyrs. And then I give you one just to show you guys specifically the sense of humor Chaucer had. You get one that's a little bit bawdy. It's pushing the envelope a little bit, like potty humor, that kind of stuff. And you're going to be like, Chaucer had that sense of humor back then? Yes, boys were always boys. And then you get some where animals are the main characters, like Fables. It teaches a message with a chicken and a rooster and a fox. And then you get a whole lot in between. You get a romantic love story, a story of chivalry and bravery, you know. Like, you can't say, nobody can say, I don't like the Canterbury Tales. You really couldn't even say, oh, I love the Canterbury Tales. You could only like or dislike individual stories because they're all told by different characters. So the way Chaucer imagines this is on the pilgrimage, 29 pilgrims are making this journey. They're all telling stories, and the way your book is outlined after the general prologue where he kind of tells you about the pilgrims and what they're doing, then each of the stories are told by one of the characters. So the knight was one of the guys on the pilgrimage, so we read the knight's tale. That's the story that the knight would have told. Then we read the miller's tale, and we read the second nun's tale, and the nun's priest's tale. All of these little stories, that's what that character would have told on the journey. I need you to understand this. These individuals did not write these stories. Who wrote the stories?
Chaucer.
But what's amazing about Chaucer writing all these stories is that he makes you believe it. You really believe this is a story a nun would tell. This is the story a bawdy, rough carpenter would tell. This is the story that a total hypocrite would tell. Okay, you even have a medieval sermon in there. And Geoffrey Chaucer is only able to do this because he has spent so much time in all those varieties of the social classes in England. He knows them personally. So he puts himself in their shoes thinking, if I were this character, this is the story I would tell. So the variety is so much fun. You guys will have a test over these 8 stories and the general prologue and the life of Chaucer on October the 31st. Rather than make a ton of copies, I am posting things on It's Learning for you just like in other classes. So on It's Learning, you will find, I have to load it later, but you are going to find the list of the specific stories that you have to read. You're not, that big book sitting in front of you, you're not reading that whole book. You're reading the prologue and 8 stories. That list will be on It's Learning. Introductory notes that will remind you of what I've talked about today and give you more information about that will be on It's Learning. Later, closer to October 31st, I will post a review sheet that will ask loads of questions about each. You know what, maybe I'll load it now so that you can use it while you're reading. Because then if you answered the questions on the review sheet while you read, you already have your review sheet completed and ready to study. It will be a multiple choice test. It's kind of long and semi-detailed, but if you've listened to this lecture and you read through the introductory notes and you kind of take notes as you go on the review guide, you should have a very good understanding of it. Chaucer's whole idea was birthed from a real life event that I'll give you more details about later, but in essence, it's about a guy named St. Thomas à Becket. And Thomas à Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury, meaning he is head of the Church of England. Okay. At the time, the king wanted to be the head over everything. And the king sort of didn't love that he's in charge of kind of the political things, but Thomas à Becket is in charge of the religious things, and they didn't see eye to eye at all. They had numerous conflicts. What happened, and I'm like bringing this down to just the absolute essentials. What happened was, one day the king is talking to his guards and he says, that guy's really ticking me off. I really wish somebody would go in and kill him. Well, they had been trained, if your ruler even suggested he wanted something done, you did it. So they go to Canterbury. This is real life history. This is not in the Canterbury Tales. This is real life. They go to Canterbury, walk into Canterbury Cathedral, and stab Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England. They stab him to death in the church. Numerous times, like bloody massacre, nasty, not just like one that would do the trick, like it's ugly. There is now a sword hanging on the wall that shows the exact place where he was murdered, and you will see it. We will go to a church service in Canterbury Cathedral. We'll hear the boys' choir singing. Afterwards, you can walk back to the shrine where there are candles lit, because people still believe that if they go to Canterbury and they kind of worship at the shrine of St. Thomas à Becket, that they could be healed or that they could be forgiven of their sins. So what this collection of stories is about is a journey, pilgrims from all over the place traveling to Canterbury. In this specific story, they start in London, in Southwark. It looks like Southwark, it's Southwark. And they're traveling from there to Canterbury. Now, by car, that's only about 45 minutes, maybe an hour and a half if traffic is bad. But on foot or by horse, that's a journey, okay? So they're all they've come from all over the place. They end up at this tavern on the same night, and they decide, we're gonna travel together, we're gonna tell stories, but they're all going for different reasons. Some to make money, some because they're trying to get right with God, some because they want healing. That's your story in a nutshell. Can you hit pause, and I'm gonna do some closing remarks. Thank you very much. Okay.